know how, like, ancient Rome and Egypt, they get all the press when it comes to shaping our modern world.
Right, yeah, for sure. Those are like the go-to ancient civilizations.
But what about, like, all those other empires and societies, the ones that don't always make the headlines, but still, like, laid down some really important foundations for how we live today?
That's exactly what I find so fascinating about this deep dive. Like, we get to uncover these often overlooked empires and, like, really appreciate their lasting impact.
Totally. And the sources you've shared have been, like, super helpful for that, like a guided tour through some of the more hidden corners of ancient history.
Exactly. And who doesn't love a good historical mystery?
So today we're going on a journey to explore 6 kind of unsung heroes of the ancient world. The Hittite Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Chaldean Empire, sometimes called the Neo-Babylonians.
Right.
And of course, the super innovative Phoenicians, the Hebrews, with their huge impact on religion and history, and then the vast Persian Empire.
An ambitious lineup.
It is. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down in a way that's, like, fun and easy to understand. We're going to get into their greatest achievements, meet some of their standout leaders, and, most importantly, see how they've shaped our world today. Let's start by traveling back in time, like way, way back, to around 2300 BCE. We're heading to Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, to meet the Hittites.
Picture this. The Hittites, they were originally from north of the Black Sea, and they migrated into this, like, pretty rugged, rocky landscape.
Not exactly like prime farmland.
No, not really.
Yeah.
But it was rich in something else. Metal ores.
Yeah.
And that's going to be really important to their story, as we'll see.
Right. That geographic detail is key. And they didn't just arrive as this, like, massive unified empire.
Definitely not. It took time for them to consolidate their power.
So, like, rewind to around 1750 BCE, and we find the Hittites living in, like, these separate city-states all over Anatolia and parts of Syria. Imagine all these little kingdoms, probably speaking different languages, with their own customs, separated by these, like, towering mountains.
A real patchwork of cultures and power struggles.
Exactly. And then along comes this king named Labarnus, and he was like a real game changer. He united most of Anatolia under his rule, creating this powerful Hittite kingdom.
He set the stage for what would become a major force in the ancient world.
Right. And then his son, Hattusilus III, he kept that momentum going. He expanded their territory into Syria, and he established their capital at Hattusa.
Hattusa was a strategic choice.
Yep.
They built it high in the mountains, surrounded by this incredible stone wall that was, get this, 26 feet thick.
Wow, talk about a fortress.
Yeah, seriously. It shows you just how much emphasis they placed on defense and also, like, the resources they were able to command.
Right. Okay, so now fast forward to Hattusilus's grandson, Marcellus I. This is where things get, like, really interesting.
Buckle up.
So the sources tell us that Marcellus I actually managed to conquer Babylon. And this was not like some small victory. Babylon was a major power center, a hub of culture and trade. It was a huge deal.
A testament to the military skill and ambition of the early Hittite kings.
Totally. But here's the twist, like right out of a history drama. When Marcellus I returned to Hattusa victorious, he was assassinated. And get this, it was his own brother-in-law who did it.
Talk about palace intrigue. It's a stark reminder that, like, even at the height of their power, these ancient rulers were vulnerable to internal threats and rivalries.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, right? Okay, so beyond military conquests and political drama, the Hittites were also, like, seriously innovative.
Oh, yeah, in ways that still impact us today.
For sure. And one of their biggest contributions was, like, their mastery of iron. Before the Hittites, most tools and weapons were made from, like, copper or bronze.
Which, are okay, but they're relatively soft metals. They can bend or get dull pretty easily.
Exactly, and they can break. But iron is a whole different story. It's much harder, much stronger, and much more durable.
And what's really amazing is that working with iron is way more complex than working with copper or bronze.
Mm-hmm.
The process of smelting iron, which means extracting the pure metal from the ore, is a lot more difficult, requires higher temperatures and more sophisticated techniques.
Right, it's a whole other level of metallurgy.
Totally. And while the exact timeline is still debated, it seems like the Hittites were among the first to really figure out how to smelt and work iron on a large scale, probably sometime between 1900 and 1400 BCE.
That's a huge leap forward in technology.
Absolutely. And it gave them a significant advantage, especially in warfare. Like, imagine going up against an army equipped with iron weapons when yours are still made of bronze.
Ouch, not a good day for the Bronze Army.
No, not at all. Okay, so another really important Hittite achievement, and this one might surprise you, is the earliest known example of a peace treaty.
A peace treaty.
Yeah, it was a treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians.
Wow. Like these were two of the biggest superpowers of the ancient world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they had been, fighting and competing for power for ages. But then, sometime in the 1200s BCE, they decided that all this conflict was just, too costly and not really accomplishing anything.
It's like they finally realized they were better off cooperating than constantly at each other's throats.
Exactly. And this wasn't just like a handshake agreement. This was a formal written document. They even engraved it on a silver plaque and made clay copies, kind of like official records. The Egyptians even had it inscribed on their temple walls.
Wow.
Talk about a commitment to peace. This was a big deal because it showed this early understanding that even if you're powerful, it's sometimes better to negotiate and compromise than to constantly fight. It was like setting ground rules for how major powers could interact with each other peacefully.
It's like the ancient world's version of the UN, kind of.
In a way, yeah. And it's a really important step towards the kind of international diplomacy we have today.
Right. That's wild to think about. Okay, so one last thing about the Hittites. Their legal system was also, pretty ahead of its time.
Oh, yeah. Their laws were interesting.
So they had this focus on compensating the victim rather than, punishing the offender in a really harsh way. They often used fines to make amends for wrongdoing.
It was more about restoring balance than exacting revenge.
Right. And this is really different from the eye for an eye approach that we see in, Babylonian law.
Yeah, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi was much stricter. If you did something wrong, the punishment was often a mirror image of the crime.
Right. So the Hittites were more focused on making things right financially, which is a pretty different perspective on justice.
It suggests a more nuanced understanding of societal harm and how to repair it. So to sum up the Hittites, they were these master iron workers, early upters of peace treaties, and they had this really interesting legal system that was focused on making amends for wrongs. That's a pretty impressive legacy.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on now, eastward from Anatolia to another major Mesopotamian power, the Assyrian Empire. Their story starts a little later, around 2000 BCE, along the upper Tigris River, and they really rose to prominence between 1600 and 612 BCE.
Yeah, they became this dominant force in the region. And unlike the Hittites, who were Indo-European, the Assyrians were a Semitic people. Their civilization is actually named after their original capital city, Ashur, which became independent around 1365 BCE.
Right, Ashur, the namesake of the Assyrians.
Exactly. Okay, so geographically speaking, Assyria had some advantages and disadvantages compared to other parts of Mesopotamia, like Babylonia to the south.
Okay, what were they?
So their location along the upper Tigris River, it usually meant they had enough rainfall for agriculture, and they also had access to timber and stone for building. So that's a plus. But the flip side is that their land wasn't as naturally fertile as the southern plains, so they still had to work hard to cultivate their crops. And their location made them a bit more vulnerable to attacks from neighboring groups.
Right, so defense was always a top priority for them.
Absolutely. And that's where they really excelled. They developed a military system that was, way ahead of its time. A standing army.
What do you mean by a standing army?
So most ancient armies were made up of citizen soldiers. These were ordinary people, often farmers, who would be called up to fight in times of war. But the Assyrians, they had professional soldiers who were dedicated to the military as their full-time job.
Wow, so they were career soldiers who trained constantly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They weren't just fighting when needed, they were always ready for battle. And this gave them a huge advantage over their enemies. They were highly skilled, well-equipped, and incredibly disciplined. And let's not forget, they had those iron weapons thanks to the Hittites, which made them even more formidable.
So they were basically the ancient world special forces.
Pretty much. And they were organized into different units, each with its own specialty. They had foot soldiers, archers, charioteers, and cavalry, all working together in coordinated attacks. They were masters of siege warfare, using battering rams and other advanced techniques to conquer fortified cities.
So yeah, they were really good at fighting. But the sources also mention that they weren't exactly known for their, kindness towards their enemies.
Yeah, that's true. They had a reputation for being quite brutal, sometimes even cruel, in their treatment of conquered populations. They would often loot and plunder cities they captured, taking everything of value. And sadly, they would sometimes massacre or enslave the people they conquered.
It's like victory came at a very high human cost.
It did. It's a dark side of their military success and something we should definitely acknowledge. But we also have to remember, this was like the norm in ancient warfare.
Right. It was a different world back then. Okay, so let's talk about their expansion. By 1100 BCE, they had grown into a massive empire, controlling much of Mesopotamia and extending their reach into parts of Anatolia, Syria, and even Egypt.
A real powerhouse. And to manage this huge territory, they had to develop some pretty effective administrative systems. They would appoint governors to rule over conquered provinces, and these governors reported directly to the Assyrian king.
It's amazing how they were able to maintain control over such a large area.
It was. And here's a fun fact. They even had this early form of a postal service. These governors would communicate with the king using messengers who rode on horseback, kind of like an ancient pony express.
That's awesome. So even back then, communication and logistics were key to ruling a big empire.
Totally. But even with all their military might and organization, the Assyrian Empire eventually fell.
What happened?
Well, like with many empires, they became overextended. They had conquered so much territory that they didn't have enough soldiers to defend it all effectively. They started relying more and more on mercenaries, foreign soldiers hired to fight for them, which could be unreliable. And eventually, a coalition of their enemies, including the Medes, Chaldeans, and Babylonians, rose up against them.
So they were like ganged up on by their rivals.
Yeah, pretty much. And they couldn't hold on. Their magnificent capital city, Nineveh, was sacked and destroyed, and the once mighty Assyrian Empire collapsed.
It's a reminder that, like, no matter how powerful you are, things can change really quickly in the ancient world.
Absolutely. But even though their empire fell, the Assyrians left behind some pretty significant achievements. They built a vast network of roads which helped connect their empire and facilitated trade. They developed a complex system of governance with appointed officials and a hierarchy of authority.
And let's not forget that they had the first real library, the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. It contained thousands of clay tablets with texts on all sorts of subjects, from history and literature to science and magic. It was a treasure trove of knowledge.
And it's thanks to those tablets that we know so much about them and other ancient cultures.
Exactly. So when we look at the bigger picture, the Assyrians showed the world how a well-organized and centralized state could be incredibly powerful. They understood the importance of infrastructure, like roads, for communication and trade. And they revolutionized warfare with their professional standing army.
Right. They were definitely ahead of their time in many ways. Okay, so next up, we have the Chaldean Empire. Remember, they were one of the groups that helped bring down the Assyrians. They established their empire in the Fertile Crescent, conquering most of what had been Assyria by 612 BCE.
You might also hear them called the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Their rule lasted until 539 BCE.
Right, so they kind of picked up where the Babylonians left off.
In a way, yeah. The Chaldean Empire was founded by a king named Nabopolassar, but it's his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who really stands out in history.
Ah, yes, Nebuchadnezzar. He's actually mentioned in the Old Testament, right?
Yes, he's known for his conquest of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity of the Hebrews, a pretty significant event in Jewish history.
Right, definitely a pivotal moment. But Nebuchadnezzar II is also remembered for something a lot more, well, spectacular. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon.
Ah, yes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world.
They sound incredible. So what were they exactly?
Well, the Hanging Gardens were basically these, massive elevated gardens built on a series of terraces. They were said to be something like 75 feet high, filled with lush vegetation, exotic plants, and all sorts of beautiful flowers.
Wow, a real oasis in the middle of the desert.
Exactly, and the story goes that Nebuchadnezzar II built them for his wife, Amytas, who was a Median princess. She was apparently homesick for the lush green mountains of her homeland and found the flat, dry landscape of Babylon kind of depressing.
So he built her this, amazing botanical wonder to cheer her up. That's pretty romantic.
It is. Although, like many things in ancient history, there's some debate about whether the Hanging Gardens actually existed or if they were just a legend. But either way, the idea of these massive man-made gardens is pretty mind-blowing, and it speaks to the power and wealth of the Chaldean Empire.
Right. I mean, to even attempt to build something like that is incredible. Okay, so besides, architectural wonders, the Chaldeans also made some important contributions to astronomy.
They did. And it's kind of ironic because their interest in astronomy actually grew out of their fascination with astrology.
Astrology, like horoscopes and stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. The Chaldeans believed that the movements of the stars and planets could influence events on Earth and even people's lives. And while we know today that astrology isn't a real science, it did lead the Chaldeans to make some pretty important astronomical observations.
So they were studying the stars to try to predict the future, but ended up making real scientific discoveries.
Exactly. They kept meticulous records of the movements of the stars and planets.
Yeah.
And through their observations, they were able to make surprisingly accurate calculations, like figuring out the length of a year with pretty good precision.
That's amazing considering they didn't have telescopes or anything like that.
It is. And those astronomical records laid the groundwork for later astronomers and helped us understand the cosmos a lot better. So the Chaldeans gave us both this mythical image of the Hanging Gardens and the real concrete beginnings of scientific astronomy.
It's like a mix of fantasy and real scientific advancement.
A good way to put it. Okay, so ready for a change of scenery? Let's head to the Mediterranean coast to meet the Phoenicians, the master seafarers and traders of the ancient world.
All right, let's set sail.
The Phoenicians were a fascinating group. They weren't really an empire in the traditional sense. Instead, they were a collection of independent city-states along the coast of what is now Lebanon, with famous cities like Tyre and Sidon being major centers of power.
Right. Lots of powerful city-states instead of one big empire.
Exactly. And they thrived from around 2000 to 800 BCE. They were originally a Canaanite people, but they became known as Phoenicians, which might come from the Greek word phoinikes, meaning purple men.
Purple men.
Yeah. It refers to their famous purple dye.
Oh, right. That Tyrian purple. It was like the most expensive and luxurious dye in the ancient world.
It was. And it was a symbol of royalty and wealth. They made it from these tiny sea snails. Yeah. And it took tons of snails to produce even a small amount of dye. So it was really valuable.
So that purple dye was like their claim to fame.
It was one of them, for sure. Yeah. But they were also incredible craftspeople and traders. They were known for their beautiful glassware, and they even developed techniques for making clear glass using quartz-rich sand, which is a pretty big deal back then.
Right, before that, most glass was like colored and kind of cloudy, right?
Exactly. They were also skilled in ivory and wood carving, pottery, and they traded in cedar wood for the mountains of Lebanon, which was highly prized for building and shipbuilding.
So they were basically the merchants of the Mediterranean.
You can say that. They sailed all over the sea, trading with everyone from the Egyptians and Greeks to the people of North Africa and Spain. And to do this, they had to become expert sailors and navigators.
Yeah, navigating the open sea back then must have been pretty challenging, with no GPS or anything.
It was. But the Phoenicians were up to the task. They developed sophisticated shipbuilding techniques and became masters of using the stars to navigate at night.
That's amazing. And they were doing this like way before the Greeks or Romans, right?
Right. There's even evidence that they might have circumnavigated Africa, sailing all the way around the continent, centuries before the Europeans.
Wow, that's an incredible feat.
It is. Okay, so as the Phoenicians sailed around the Mediterranean, they started setting up trading posts in strategic locations. The most famous of these was Carthage in North Africa.
Oh yeah, Carthage, I've heard of that. They eventually became a major rival to Rome, right?
They did. But before that, they were this thriving Phoenician colony, a center of trade and commerce. And they weren't the only ones. The Phoenicians had trading posts all over the place, from Utica in North Africa to Cadiz in Spain, as well as settlements on islands like Cyprus and Rhodes.
So they were like connecting the entire Mediterranean world through their trade network.
They were. And that brings us to probably their most important and lasting contribution, the alphabet.
The alphabet.
Yep. Before the Phoenicians, writing systems were pretty complex. They used pictographs or logograms where each symbol represented a whole word or an idea. Think of hieroglyphics in Egypt or cuneiform in Mesopotamia.
Right, lots of symbols to memorize.
Exactly. But the Phoenicians came up with a brilliant idea. What if each symbol represented a sound instead? And that's how the alphabet was born. They created a system of just 22 letters, which made writing much simpler and easier to learn.
So, like, instead of having to memorize thousands of symbols, you could just learn 22 letters and combine them to make any word.
Precisely. It was a game changer for communication and literacy. And the Greeks, they were quick to see the value of this new system. They adopted the Phoenician alphabet, made some adaptations, and it eventually evolved into the alphabet we use today.
So the letters we use to write English and most other European languages, they all came from the Phoenicians.
It all started with them, and from there the alphabet spread all over the world. It's hard to overstate how important this invention was. It made writing more accessible, allowed for the easier spread of knowledge and ideas, and really laid the foundation for our modern world of communication.
It's like the internet of the ancient world.
In a way, yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about the Hebrews. They're another group whose impact on history, especially in the realms of religion, law, and ethics, has been absolutely enormous.
Okay, the Hebrews, their story starts in Mesopotamia too, right?
It does. They were originally a nomadic, pastoral people, and their story begins around 2000 BCE in Mesopotamia, just like the Assyrians.
Right, so another group with Mesopotamian roots.
Exactly. And over time, they migrated to the region near the Mediterranean Sea in the Middle East. They called their land Israel, and they're considered the ancestors of modern-day Jews.
Okay, so ancient Israel. That's a place we hear a lot about in history and in the news.
It is, for sure. And a key event in early Hebrew history is the Exodus, the story of how a group of Hebrews migrated to Egypt, were enslaved there, and then were led out of captivity by Moses.
Ah, the Exodus, like the parting of the Red Sea and all that.
That's the one. It's a foundational story in the Hebrew Bible, and it marks the beginning of the Hebrews as a distinct people with their own identity and destiny. According to their tradition, after the Exodus, they were led by Joshua to conquer Canaan and establish their own kingdom with Jerusalem as its capital.
So a pretty dramatic and epic story of liberation and nation building.
Absolutely. But what really sets the Hebrews apart from most other ancient cultures is their development of monotheism.
Monotheism.
Yeah, that's the belief in one God. And this was a radical idea in the ancient world where most people believed in many gods and goddesses.
Right, like the Greek and Roman pantheons with like gods for everything.
Exactly. But the Hebrews believed in one God, Yahweh, who was the creator of everything and who demanded their exclusive worship. They rejected the worship of idols and images, focusing instead on a direct relationship with God through prayer and obedience to his laws.
That's a pretty big shift in thinking from polytheism.
It was a huge shift.
Yeah.
And it had a profound impact on the development of Western religion and culture.
So what were their laws like?
Well, their laws were based on their belief in one God who was the source of all morality. They had the 10 Commandments, which you've probably heard of.
Yeah.
They laid out basic ethical principles like, don't steal, don't murder, don't lie, honor your parents, and so on.
Right, the 10 Commandments.
Exactly. And they had many other laws, too, covering everything from how to treat the poor and the sick to how to conduct business fairly. And what's important here is that their laws applied to everyone, including kings and rulers.
So even the most powerful people had to obey the same rules.
That was the idea. It was a pretty radical concept in a world where kings were often considered above the law.
Right, a real step towards equality under the law.
Exactly. Okay, so the Hebrews had periods of independence and established kingdoms with famous kings like Saul, David, and Solomon. But their history is also marked by conflict and conquest. They were eventually conquered by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, and their temple in Jerusalem was destroyed.
So they went through some really tough times.
They did. But their religious beliefs and their cultural identity proved to be incredibly resilient. They maintained their faith and their traditions even in exile, and they eventually returned to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. And even though they were later conquered by other empires, their religious and ethical ideas continued to spread, influencing the development of both Christianity and Islam.
Wow. So the Hebrews, despite all the challenges they faced, they left behind a legacy that continues to shape our world today.
They did. They gave us the concept of ethical monotheism, which has been foundational to Western religion and morality. They also gave us the Hebrew Bible, which is a cornerstone of both Judaism and Christianity. And they showed us the importance of upholding ethical principles even in the face of adversity.
Okay, one more empire to explore on our ancient world tour. The Persians. They built a massive empire to the east of the Fertile Crescent in what's now Iran and Afghanistan.
Yeah, the Persian Empire was huge. And unlike the Assyrians and Hebrews, who were Semitic peoples, the Persians were Indo-European. They called themselves Aryans, which is where the modern country of Iran gets its name.
Right, Iran, from the ancient Aryans.
Exactly. And their rise to power began with a pretty remarkable leader, Cyrus the Great.
Cyrus the Great.
Yep. He was originally the ruler of a Persian province, but in 550 BCE, he defeated the Medes, who were another Iranian people who controlled a large empire. And by uniting the Persians and the Medes, he created this powerful new force.
So he was like a unifier and a conqueror.
He was both. And he didn't stop there. Over the next 15 years, Cyrus led his armies on a series of conquests, taking over Asia Minor, the Fertile Crescent, parts of Central Asia, and even Egypt. He built this vast empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River.
Wow. That's a lot of conquering in a short amount of time.
It is. And what's really interesting is that, unlike some other conquerors, Cyrus was known for being relatively tolerant and benevolent towards the people he conquered.
He wasn't all about, like, fire and sword.
Not really. He often allowed conquered peoples to keep their own customs, religions, and even their local rulers, as long as they paid taxes and remained loyal to the Persian Empire.
So more about, like, integration than domination.
Yeah, you could say that. He was famous for freeing the Jews from their exile in Babylon and allowing them to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. It was a pretty big deal and showed his commitment to religious tolerance.
Wow, that's quite a reputation.
It is. But ruling such a vast and diverse empire was a huge challenge, which brings us to another important Persian ruler, Darius III.
Darius the First. What was he known for?
Well, he was known for being a really effective administrator. He understood that to keep such a large empire stable, he needed to create a system that could manage it all efficiently.
Makes sense. What did he do?
So he divided the empire into 20 provinces called satrapies.
Satrapies.
Yeah, basically like smaller administrative units.
Yeah.
And he appointed a governor, called a satrap, to rule over each one. The satraps were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and making sure things ran smoothly in their provinces.
It's kind of like how modern countries are divided into states or provinces, right?
It is, yeah. It was a way to decentralize power and make governing a huge empire more manageable.
Smart.
And to keep an eye on things, Darius also appointed other officials, like judges and tax collectors, to work within each satrapy. He even had these imperial inspectors, called the eyes and ears of the king, who traveled around the empire making sure that everyone was loyal and that things were running according to his laws.
So he had, like, his own internal affairs department to keep things honest?
Pretty much. And another thing Darius did was build a network of roads throughout the empire. The most famous of these was the Royal Road, which stretched for over 1,600 miles, connecting Susa, the Persian capital, to Sardis in Anatolia.
1,600 miles. That's like the width of the entire United States.
It was a huge undertaking. And these roads were like super important for communication, trade, and moving troops around quickly. So Darius was all about efficiency and central control. He built this elaborate system to manage his vast empire, and it worked pretty well for a couple of centuries.
Pretty impressive. And the Persians also had their own unique religion, right?
They did. It was called Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster, and it became the official religion of the Persian Empire for quite a while.
Zoroastrianism. I've heard of that, but I don't really know much about it.
Well, it's a fascinating religion. It has this dualistic worldview, meaning it sees the universe as a battleground between two opposing forces, good and evil.
Okay, like a cosmic struggle.
Exactly. They believed in one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, who represented good and light. And then there was this evil spirit, Engram Mainyu, who represented darkness and destruction. And humans had to choose which side they were on.
So like a constant battle between good and evil playing out on a cosmic scale.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they believed in an afterlife where people would be judged based on their actions in life. And their holy book is called the Avesta.
Interesting. So Zoroastrianism was a pretty influential religion in the ancient world.
It was. And it actually still exists today, although there aren't very many Zoroastrians left.
Huh. I didn't realize it was still around.
It is. Okay, so the Persian Empire eventually fell, conquered by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE.
Alexander the Great, that guy got around.
He did. But even though the empire fell, the Persians left behind a lasting legacy. Their administrative innovations, like their system of satrapies, influenced later empires. Their road building was impressive, and Zoroastrianism had a significant impact on religious thought.
So they were more than just conquerors, they were innovators and builders.
Definitely. They laid the groundwork for many aspects of government, infrastructure, and religious thought that we see in later periods of history.
Wow. So as we wrap up this whirlwind tour of the ancient world, it's amazing to see how each of these empires, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, and the Persians, they all contributed something unique and important to the world we live in today.
It really highlights how interconnected history is and how even these seemingly distant civilizations have shaped our modern world in profound ways.
Absolutely. We saw how the Hittites were pioneers in ironworking and diplomacy, how the Assyrians created a powerful military machine and developed complex systems of governance,
And how the Chaldeans, through their interest in astrology, made some pretty significant contributions to astronomy.
And who could forget the Phoenicians, who gave us the alphabet, arguably one of the most important inventions in human history.
And the Hebrews, with their revolutionary idea of monotheism and their emphasis on ethical conduct and the rule of law, they've had an immeasurable impact on Western religion and morality.
And the Persians, with their innovative administrative systems, their impressive road networks, and their unique religious ideas.
It's truly mind-blowing to consider how all these pieces fit together, and how these ancient societies, through their interactions and innovations, laid the foundation for so much of what we take for granted today.
It's like this big, complex tapestry of history, and we've only just begun to explore it.
And that's what's so exciting. There's always more to learn, more connections to discover, and more to appreciate about the ingenuity and resilience of these ancient civilizations.
So to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to keep digging, keep exploring, and keep asking those big questions about the past. Because as we've seen today, the ancient world is full of surprises, and its legacy continues to shape our world in countless ways.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the ancient world. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have. Until next time, keep exploring.
And keep learning.